behalf of the Montrose Lady Bird Group, and I presume that's everybody present.
Yes.
Thanks very much. We are essentially, myself and Barry here, and Helen, the George Beattie Project. Okay, and the clues in the name, we've been researching George Beattie for the past 3.5 years. Okay. Now, before I go, I would like to read out our own mission statement as regarding the project and what we're all about and where we hope to take the project in the future. We endeavour to restore the memory and literary legacy of George Beattie to the rightful place in Scottish history. We endeavour to set the record straight by revealing the misinformation, disinformation and deceits of the past which we have discovered in the traditionally accepted story of George Beattie. And I see that's the last ticket. We endeavour to attain moral and social justice on all possible levels, as we sincerely believe that the initial suppression of truth and the subsequent systematic obliteration of the memory and literary legacy of George Beattie has been and remains to be a true moral and social injustice perpetrated against posterity and the Scottish people by certain socially powerful individuals attempting to shield themselves from the deserved consequences of their immoral actions and corrupt agenda. Controversial stuff here, girls. Strap yourselves in. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to go into the accepted narrative of George Beattie. This is what we call the accepted narrative. Everybody here, I presume, has heard of George Beattie, circa 1786, 1823. Okay?
Can I just ask, what is it you know? You know, how much information are you aware of?
Nothing.
Beattie's grave.
All you hear is Beattie chewing.
That's all.
Was he murdered?
And he was a poet.
As far as we're concerned, that's exactly what the evidence shows.
No, we'll go into that anyway. So anyway, let's keep cracking on here, okay. So basically, there is, you don't know a lot about the man, okay, but what I'll do just now, I'll give you a brief narrative of what some people are aware of when it comes to the story of George Beattie. He was born in Whitehills in St Cyrus on the 18th of September 1786, and he was born to an Elizabeth Scott and William Beattie, and he was one of 7 children. That's all our own research, and it's all primary source research. Okay, girls? After a good education, he works as a lawyer's clerk in Aberdeen. He finishes his legal education in Edinburgh. Excuse me. He returns to Montrose. He sets up a legal practice with his brother David Beattie. He also publishes various poems, and his most famous one was, of course, John O'Arna. And personally speaking, I quite like a lot of George's work. It's really worth looking at. Now, he starts up a relationship, and this is where the story really kicks off. He starts a relationship with a local squire's daughter, oddly named William Gibson, which I've heard in dispatches wasn't too unusual for the times. A Miss William Gibson. Now, news of inheritance, and this is where everything goes pear-shaped to say. News of an inheritance comes through from an uncle who was in the island of Grenada. Now, subsequent to this, the relationship turns sour. Now, Miss Gibson then turns her attention to a local corn merchant by the name of a William Smart. Now, the pain of humiliation from the breakup of the relationship caused George Beattie to subsequently take his own life. That basically is the accepted narrative of the man's life. Simple as that.
That was very good and very short.
So anyway, that's us finished now. Now, accepted narrative. Now, we'll move on here. All this information essentially comes from a biography that was published in 1863, 40 years after George's death.
Which is key in itself.
Now this is the actual main source information. The biography in itself is interesting, if you look at biography, because the author of the biography remained anonymous, and there was a lot of pieces in that biography that we had to find out what's going on here. Now I'm going to move on to one particular point in this. It's all down to money at the end of the day. Let's be honest. Okay. Now, in this biography, if we focus on the fact that on the relationship between George and Miss William Gibson, once she hears that there's an inheritance coming from this uncle, okay, she then ditches George, citing a couple of reasons, but he wasn't the proper status in life, and he was only after her money. Now, if we examine these points, we find that they don't really hold a lot of water. After all, George Beattie is a working lawyer, so the status in life doesn't really hold a lot of water. And George is relatively well off in his own right anyway. If you look at his will at the time of his death, he's probably worth... He's not short of being a millionaire, let's be honest. He's got a good business going, you know. He was very well thought of in the town, extremely well thought of. And I'm going to read out an obituary to you later on, okay? What the people in the town of Montrose thought about George Beattie. Now, when we consider the book and where the money came from, because I think this is really the key point here in this story, I'll focus on this, and I'll mention a few other bits and pieces, and then I'll move on to Barry later on when it comes to the conspiracy. But I'm just going to focus on the actual facts of the story as we've actually found them. Now, in the biography, as I mentioned, it was written in 1863. This money came from an uncle who was, quote, the governor of Granada. Okay then, we take that as a statement of fact. But once we look at who this chap was, a William Mitchell, a quick Google search tells us there was no such chap who was, quote unquote, the governor of Granada at that time. So the inference being was that he was the governor of Granada under the king's behest. You know, he was working for the state. But
Respectable, in other words.
There was no person of that name in Granada. So we had to find out who this chap was. So we employed the services of professional researchers down in London, and they looked at the records for us, and it turns out that this William Mitchell was a plantation owner. He owned slaves. This is where this money was coming from. Exactly. And it was actually very, very interesting information. Now, if somebody goes out to write a biography in somebody's life, you think you would get these points accurate. But he's just failed to mention these points. So this is all new, freshly researched information. Now, the money mentioned in this chap's will, the biographer had it right when it came to the amounts of money. It was £5,000 in them days, consols, to the sister, £5,000 to the brother, £3,500 to Miss William Gibson, the niece, and £3,150 to a black housekeeper. This is all very interesting stuff here. The black housekeeper evidently is not a black housekeeper, it's a business partner. But the biography informs us that the Sarah Bronker, who was the black housekeeper in the biography, actually turns out to be a business partner. And she had loaned William Mitchell £3,150.
Which is about £2.5 million now.
And through the will, he was promised to give it back. So we're dealing with about £20 million here in today's money. And all these wills are available, we have them on the website, and they're available to view through Scotland's People. So it's all public information. All very interesting stuff when it comes to the actual money. Now, what we've actually done now is, see when you look at the wills of the beneficiaries, there is no mention of any of this money being realised at all. At all, nowhere. I've looked through the wills time and time again, and through the inventories and the testimonies, there's no mention of this money. I'm now led to believe that this money was never realised in the first place. So I found a record down in London, both of us have found a record down in London, and it's the Chancery Court in London. We now believe that this estate from the West Indies went into liquidation. He didn't have the money, he owed too much money out, this chap. So this whole story is developing probably on a daily, certainly a weekly basis and a monthly basis. So we'll be certainly be back at some point with fresh, updated, brand new information. But that's where we stand at the moment.
See, this is the machine behind the story. Why this money was expected, and that's why William Smart did what he did, and why the whole Gibson and Smart families did what they did and drove George, because we believe that they asked him to, in his capacity as a writer, you know, so he was able to write the documents as well as being a solicitor. We believe he was asked to do something on the strength of his relationship, and once he found out the moral corruption of what he was being asked to do, because he obviously had no idea about the slave connection of the plantation at all. Because Sarah Bronker, for example, the black housekeeper, he believed she was just a black housekeeper, but that was the pseudonym or whatever that Miss Gibson used when they were writing to each other. You call me or write to me as Sarah Bronker. Miss Gibson would do that, and then his name was, because that was his humour, George Smelly. So you're right, so nobody would know exactly who they would just leave the letters to each other. So and that was basically it. But it's the expectation of this money is the whole point to this whole story, and the greed thereof, you know, and the anticipation of it.
Anyway, I'm going to go on to a couple of wee anomalies. Well,
do the obituary first.
Oh, do you want me to read the obituary?
Aye.
Do you want me to read the obituary?
Aye,
It's
it's
actually
important to
lovely.
understand why. Our whole point is why this town has got no memorial to George Beattie, when he was considered the most popular man and the most loved man that ever lived in this area. It's absurd when there's so many others. His literary legacy, there's what, half a dozen or more books in the library. The schools don't know. We've sent the book all over the place, free of charge. It's £20 a pop. We have to pay that. I've never had one just acknowledgement of receipt or cheers or what, no, nothing. Saying all the head teachers, anybody, any institution head of it, we've been totally, stonewalled. Not a thing. And that's just part of it. Once you add it all up, it suggests there's still some kind of agenda out there to obfuscate this whole story.
So anyway, this is now, obviously, through talking to people like yourselves and talking to people in the town, we're trying to restore the memory of George Beattie, okay? And we think he's a very deserving cause, obviously, okay?
This is an unbiased.
So this is actually written in the Montrose Review in 1823, October the 9th, which is a week after his death. And this is what the town thought of George Beattie at that particular time. And we think it's quite moving and quite touching. So this is a obituary from the Montrose Review on October the 9th, 1823. It is with no ordinary feelings of regret that we have to record the death of Mr. George Beattie, writer here, which happened on the 29th ultimo. In his professional capacity, Mr. Beattie was eminent for his integrity, abilities and conciliatory disposition, which made him regard what was just rather than what was scientific. As a scholar, nay as a philosopher, his mind was stored with whatever is excellent in literature, and he admired whatever is grand, impressive and interesting in nature. He was both a man of observation and reflection, and his remarks were listened to with that degree of attention which a superior judgment always commands. Above all, as a man, as an upright, independent, generous and sociable man, he was honoured, esteemed and beloved. Nor was this tribute paid to the qualities of his heart in a common or a partial degree, but warmly and generally. His satirical powers, which keeping a judicious aim, became an active virtue itself, were elucidated in many instances and thrown with subtle keenness against vice, folly and corruption. In testimony of this, he has left behind him many admired specimens, both in prose and verse. The milder effusions of his genius abound in sentiment and pathos, equal at least to many of the more lauded poetical pieces of the day. And had he prosecuted with ardour that gift which he was favoured, he might have laid claim to a palm which a less qualified muse may now possess.
Robert Southey.
Indeed. His humour was unbounded, and was of such a nature that it delighted all who had the honour of his acquaintance, without hurting the feelings of any. He was a firm patriot, a universal philanthropist, and a warm friend. Noble, generous, honest, modest, unassuming, feeling. He was a man who mixed with opposite parties and was equally beloved by all. It may be thought by those who shared not the pleasures of his society that this outline of Mr. Beattie's character and qualities is a labour panegyric, and we now confess that of an individual at a distance we should have suspected so. But to those who knew him, it will appear only an attempt to draw the contour of a picture which everyone admired in its natural perfection. As public journalists, we have no right to intrude with our own private feelings in lamenting the death of this worthy and valuable member of society, but it would have been doing injustice to the public, whose concern is deep upon this occasion, to have said less. And we are assured that none will contradict us when we declare that no man in this town and neighbourhood was ever more generally beloved in his life or more universally lamented in his death. Now that's what they thought of George Beattie back then. So it's quite a, it's really quite something. That's what we feel. That's the obituary from the Moonshot Review.
So you mentioned the contradiction.
Yeah, I'm just going to...
Oh, right.
Okay, right. Now, there's a few anomalies here that we find interesting, but there's only something just for... These are just little points for you to chew over. And it's probably one of... These are the wee anomalies that actually sort of dragged me into this story, which I really found interesting. When Barry said to me that day down in St Cyrus, "This is George Beattie's headstone," what do you find odd about it? It was the simple fact that there was no mention of his family on that headstone. I don't know if that's a usual or an unusual thing, but it wasn't a loving son, brother, so on and so forth. And there was no mention of his immediate family on that headstone. That's something for us to think about, I think.
What, birth date?
Nothing
Just a
at
year.
all.
Just a year. And in the
And of
biography,
course-
just a year ago. Nobody had his actual date.
Yeah, but then he was a suicide in those days, didn't they?
But
This is very true.
no, but there
This
was
is
no
what it
recorded of his actual birth date anywhere, even in the biography. That was just unknown up until, and now we think we know why.
Yeah, well, so anyway, the author of the biography was preferred to remain anonymous, which we found interesting. Now, there's no mention at all of his brother James. Now, he inherited George's estate because George died intestate. He'd left a will, but because he died 8 days before the 60 days validation period of a will, he died intestate. Now, this is unusual. He writes a will out.
Goes to a lot of
He's a
trouble for
lawyer.
that.
He knows fine well he's worth a lot of money, and he knows fine well if he was to die before the 60 days, the money is going to go to his eldest brother. Now, we don't actually think, because of our own research, we could be here all day in these particular pieces of research, different strands of research that we've done when it comes to the actual family. We'd be here all day on it. So we're not just sort of skimming over it. We're just giving you the main bullet points of the story. But that's an interesting thing for you to think about. He actually dies 8 days before the 60 days validation period.
So the most important thing here is there's obviously an estrangement between him and his brother James, because he never mentions James at any time. They were polar opposites in their political beliefs, because George is opposed to any form of oppression, or the basically anti-monarchy church and state. Just not because he's anti-religious as such, just doesn't like the draconian oppression that they were being impressed upon him at that time. But and obviously the father and the brother were customs officers, so they were working for the crown. So there was probably a contradiction in beliefs, and they just parted company. So he did not want his brother to end up with his Lumleys, because he thought so much of his sister and the brother. He wanted to look after him, so it makes no sense you would wait 52 days and then just 8 days before. That's just one of the things that's suspicious. But it's so much to this story. You
Yeah,
can't
we
really
could,
do
as
it
I said, be
justice.
here all day. Now, there's certain pieces of misinformation that we've actually noticed that is now circulating when it comes to this particular story. There's historical societies in this area. There's 2 in the town. Now, I'm based in Glasgow, obviously. I live in Glasgow. I've always lived in Glasgow. And there's historical societies in Glasgow that are embracing this story down there. Right? I've been in touch with the West of Scotland Family Historical Society, and they're going to publish a piece on George Beattie because the secretary of that particular organisation went to school in St Cyrus, and she finds the story extremely interesting, so she's going to run. Now the thing that this is the fine point that I want to put in this, you would think with the amount of research that we've put into this particular story that the historical societies in the area would embrace us. Now, for whatever reason, I don't know if I've got the wrong t-shirts on or something, or I don't know. No, I couldn't answer that question. But for whatever reason, they're not picking up on the story at all, and they're not assisting us. Maybe we're expecting too much in life, I don't know, but for whatever reason, they're not embracing us.
There's one reason which I'll go into.
Yeah, I'll let Barry deal with these things. As I say, I'll just try and give you the factual things of it. In one publication alone, when they're referring to George Beattie's story in certain snapshots, the story is so far off our research, it's as if it's nothing to do with the story at all. And when we brought this point up to the historical society in question, what was the answer?
They're just well-meaning amateurs. Leave them alone. And we're always being respectful, constantly. Always been respectful, but it was a case of it was blatant error and slanderous statements. And we asked, where does this information come from? Because it totally contradicts. So you're saying it's being published that George and his friends, which were well placed, Burnes and all, that's Burns' first cousin, there was 5 of them particularly, they are being called a noble band of reformers who paved the way for Joseph Hume. So he's got a huge statue out there. So they were of the same mind as him, a noble band of reformers. Whereas this book says George Beattie and his cronies once again behaving anti-socially. And where is this coming from? There was no source. That's what we got back. There's no source for this whatsoever.
We heard it somewhere.
So you publish something without any foundation whatsoever. Yeah.
But leave them alone.
Other help, come back to us. So, you know what I mean? So, wait a minute, but this is causing us a huge problem here because people are reading this and taking it as the truth. Because that was my argument. It says, with respect, I don't think people